All right. Well, you know it's the last one because I have pants on. I promised someone who will remain nameless that I would wear pants to the last one, even though it's 100 and a gazillion degrees outside. So when we come down to the last one of the year, I've always got my paper of people, to thank. The first person, my mother Jane, who always supports the Rejebian review series. And she, like a couple other people that came up to me tonight, think that we should just do this week in and week out all year long. So if we were going to do that, we would have to recruit you all to start being book reviewers because I don't know where we'd find 52 of them. But it's been a fun summer. I also want to thank, and I tried to get her to come in here tonight, but she said she had another catering job she had to go to, which I don't believe her because she doesn't like coming in here. But Joni Thompson with Preston Hollow Catering. The food this year has been, for those of you all that ate, out of this world. And as I said before, I don't know how you serve that food for $15 when you see what you get at a McDonald's or Whataburger or any place today, but it's darn good. So Joni, thank you. All the people in building services to get this building cranked up on a Wednesday at 5:00 for us to come in and do our thing. And my friend up top, Jackson Harkey, who I've said before, I think I've known since I was probably, since I was, I don't know how old, but it's been a long time. So Jackson's here every week. I get these photographs that I give him to put up on the screen, and he kind of looks at me kind of squinty-eyed, but always does it. And I want to also introduce Jackson, thank you. Our Rejebian committee, and I'll just go down the names, and I think just about everybody is here. Of course, our book reviewer tonight, Dana Harkey. Amy Berry I saw sitting somewhere. Susan Wilson, who is in various spots. Nancy Turner, Ann Kite, Gail Daly, and Shannon Cox. And of course, he didn't want me to say anything too much about him, but I always do, Richard Stanford, because I think the growth of this series can be stamped with the two words, Richard Stanford. So Richard, thank you. And I also want to thank lastly, but certainly not leastly, is leastly a word? It is now, Arang Sistuli. So Arang has kind of taken over a lot of the heavy lifting that Richard did. And I don't want to say she's done it better, but she's kind of done it better. In fact, she's even roped her husband, Joe, into sitting up at the desk when you all come in at 5 or 5:30 every Wednesday. So thank you very much. Stand up, please. So there you go. I can't promise anything about weekly. Somebody also said something about maybe we could do once a month. Oh, of course, Dr. Pirtle's going to ask me something. I thought when you had pants that got holes in them, you just threw those away. Or we used to cut them off and make water skiing shorts out of them. Anyway, the most important group to thank is all of you all, because without you coming, we wouldn't have this. So thank you. So in the spirit of bringing in all the heavy hitters, I'm going to introduce Walt Markham to welcome us, and then introduce Ann Kite, I think, to introduce Dana. And then I'll be back for one final spin around the room at the end of the review.
David, thank you. On behalf of Highland Park United Methodist Church, we want to officially welcome you. We're delighted that you're here. Isn't this just an outstanding series? And it gets better and better and better. And I know Richard and Arang and others have poured their lives and soul in this. So I'm Walt Markham. I'm one of the ministers on staff. Been here 32 years, believe it or not. I'm currently training my third senior minister, and I think we're doing pretty good. Um, there are so many things our church offers. Richard said I should highlight. We have, for example, on Sunday morning, 11 o'clock, a worship service that's a teaching service. It's called Kerygma. We do a lot of in-depth stuff. Richard and I do a class Wednesdays. Currently, we're in the Apocrypha. But we are in the book of Enoch, and people are having fun. What does that tell you? So, again, we're delighted that you're here and hope you will take advantage of this church and all the opportunities it offers. So let me pray us in, and we'll introduce Ann Kite. Heavenly Father, what an honor, a privilege, and a delight it is to be here, a part of this historic ministry of our church. Lord, we thank you for the Rejebian family and for their creating this event and for their continuing to support it across the many decades. Be with us tonight as Dana brings us another one of our outstanding book reviews. And God, it is a joy simply to be together, to eat together, and to learn together. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. And Kite, come, you have an introduction.
Thank you so much, Walt. Dana Harkey was born and raised in Arkansas, Stuttgart to be precise. Dana's spirit of service was influenced by family examples set by 4 generations of Arkansas farmers, Methodist, and civic leaders. And she will quickly tell you that the best rice in the world is from Arkansas. Dallas became home to Dana when she enrolled at SMU. Dana graduated from SMU with a bachelor's degree in education, elementary, and a master of liberal arts, and a husband, Jackson. Dana has been an active member at Highland Park United Methodist Church for decades. Her commitment to Christian education runs deep. She's taught Sunday morning classes for all ages, led Bible studies, and confirmation classes. Dana worked with Highland Park leadership to create the Affirmation Sunday morning class, which is a loving, inclusive community for all Christians. Dana has served as president of United Methodist Women and a leader for Circle 18. She has dedicated her time and talents to support many of the HPUMC missions, such as Wesley Rankin Center, Brother Bill's Helping Hand, Meals on Wheels, Carpenters for Christ, Night Owl, C.C. Young, Dickinson Place, Dallas Bethlehem Center. I've only named a few. Dana and Jackson have 2 children, Blake and his wife Hannah, and Amanda and her husband Rob, and 3 adorable grandchildren, Eleanor, Dub, and Andrew. Dana and Jackson delight in being the babysitter, taxi, school volunteer, and traveling companions. In her free time, Dana's an avid bridge player, member of 2 garden clubs, and she is, of course, in several book clubs. Dana has been a book reviewer for over 10 years. She loves to tell stories about history, women, art, and adventures that you may have never heard of. It is an honor to introduce my friend of 40 plus years, Dana Harkey.
Thank you, thank you. Well, thank you for coming here tonight. It's the end of the season, and you never know what you're going to get toward the end. And so I'm just appreciative of everybody being here. I'm going to talk about a book called Sweet Land of Liberty tonight. It's kind of I hope it's not anticlimactic. You remember, those of you who've been here every week, the first one was The King of Diamonds, Crime in Dallas. And then we had The Black Widow, Murder in Highland Park. And then we had Bonnie and Clyde. Thanks, Richard. And then we had the forensics of Agatha Christie. I mean, it's been a really wild season so far. So I thought, just to kind of, keep you in the mood, I'm not going to talk about murder tonight. I'm just going to show you that one picture. And pies are what I'm going to talk about. And we all love pies. And guess what was in the comics this very morning? A plugger, an old person like me, knows that fruit pie is an acceptable breakfast food. All in favor? Yes. Yay, fruit pie. So this book is called Sweet Land of Liberty. Every year when I start thinking about what book I want to live with for the next year, I want it to be interesting to me. I want it to be on a topic that I like. Well, I do like food. And this book is written by a food historian. Did you all know there's an actual job called food historian? I want that job. I love history and I love food. So this lady is Rossi Anastopoulos, and she's written a book. She is a first-generation American. Her parents immigrated from Greece. And in her daytime job, she is the blog editor of King Arthur Flowers. So she's a baker. She knows recipes. She knows food writing. And so when she decided she wanted to put a book together to talk about food trends in the United States, this was what the book she came up with. And just like, I forgot I'm supposed to do this now. Just like every year, when I get on a topic, invariably I find another book that really fits my topic well. And this year, it is this gorgeous cookbook that it is so beautiful. You could use it as a coffee table book. And we're going to talk a little bit about it too. It's by a woman named Stacey May Wang Fong. And she subtitles it, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the United States Through Pies. So those two books just went together perfectly. Now, when we think about pie, we think about the quintessential apple pie. But before we get to that apple pie, I want to talk a little bit about the cherry pie. Now, in February, we make cherry pies in honor of President's birthday. Why cherry pies? Well, because of this man right here, pulling the curtain back, is Beth Pirtle's ancestor, Parson Weems, and he wrote a biography of George Washington the year after George died. And in it, he included this sweet little story about little George, 6-year-old George, was so excited to get an axe for his 6th birthday that he kind of went wild and chopped down a cherry tree. That night, when his father got home, his father said, "Who chopped down this cherry tree?" And little George put his axe behind his back and said, "I cannot tell a lie. It was I, Father, who chopped down the cherry tree." Now, I want you to look at this one. This painting is by Grant Wood. Grant Wood is the painter who did American Gothic, the two very sober farm people standing there with their pitchfork. That's his most famous painting. But this is one of his famous ones. And if I can make this, nope, I can't do that. But look at little George's face. What do you see? It's the same George that's on your dollar bill. Isn't that interesting that little George had that face when he was 6 years old? So. But anyway, we make these cherry pies in honor of that cherry pie that George could not tell a lie about, and another very honest president, honest Abe Lincoln. We celebrate their birthdays and President's Day with cherry pies. Now, there's another side to cherry pies. Cherry pie became an emblem of the Civil Rights Movement. In 1961, a young man named Ezel Blair Jr. put on his church clothes, a white shirt, a black tie, shined his shoes, and went to the Woolworth lunch counter, where he sat down and ordered a piece of cherry pie and a cup of coffee. He was refused service. Oops, sorry. I'll get this in a minute. He was refused service because he was black. The people at the Woolworths lunch counter refused to serve him. So cherry pie became an emblem of the Civil Rights Movement. Other peaceful protests would have the college students usually, or the black people coming in, sitting down and ordering cherry pie. And it also became a weapon. Many white people, enraged by this, would take pie and throw it, especially that cherry pie, on their white shirts. So it was the humble cherry pie became a metaphor for racial victory. Years later, about 10 years later, Easel came back to that lunch counter and he sat down and he ordered a slice of cherry pie and a cup of coffee, and he ate it there. And it was considered a racial victory for the civil rights movement. And he said, it wasn't even that good. I have to share my own experience with cherry pie. It wasn't in the book, but this was so significant to my life that I have to share it with you. When I was a junior in high school, there was nothing I wanted more than to be county champion 4-H girl. That was a big deal, 4-H, head, heart, hands, and health. In the farm community, that was a really big deal, and I wanted to be the county champion 4-H girl. Up until that time, my 4-H experience had been square dancing and raising a steer for the Fat Stock Show. But to be county champion girl, they gave you a list of activities that you had to choose from. One was sewing a skirt. That wasn't going to happen for me. And there was something else that I knew I couldn't do. But one was baking a pie. My mother was the best pie cook in the county. And so I thought I could bake a pie. Mother could teach me how to bake a pie. Except my mother's pie crust were light and flaky and made with chilled Crisco. You all know that kind, right? You had to follow the county's recipe, and it used Wesson oil for the lard and for the fat in the crust. It was gummy. It was gray by the time I had rolled it out. It was really bad. My poor high school boyfriend ate a lot of really bad cherry pies that year. But eventually, the county agents saw the wisdom of looking at my other activities, and I did get to be county champion girl with a very subpar cherry pie. Okay, pie is ubiquitous in America. That story I told just tells us that. You see pies everywhere. That was one reason this author chose pies to tell the story. She's not telling about the best pies. She's telling about pies that set trends in America. Just like that cherry pie was a symbol of the civil rights movement. So she's going to talk about that, but pies are everywhere. You'll see them on your Thanksgiving table, church potlucks, a greasy spoon diner, a fancy pie shop in Bishop Arts District in West Dallas. You can see them just about anywhere. The author said there's 4 reasons she wanted to talk about pies. First of all, pies are uniquely American. We're going to talk about that. You don't see pies. Don't order apple pie in France. You'll get an apple tart. And don't order a lemon meringue pie in Italy because they won't know what you're talking about. Maybe you'll get a little sip of limoncello instead. So pies are uniquely American. And second, pies are very adaptable. You could probably look in your pantry right now and find something to make a pie. It might be a sweet pie, a savory pie. You could probably find something to make a pie with in there. Third, pies aren't necessary. Desserts are optional with a meal. I know that's almost heresy, but desserts are usually optional with a meal. They don't have to go. So pies are unnecessary. When you have one, it's special, right? And fourth, pies are delicious. Okay, the story of America itself, following the narrative of our country and its evolution over centuries of innovations and change, can be told with pies. So let's begin with apple pie, the famous American as apple pie. Now, apple tarts existed in England, in France, and Holland, and the Netherlands for that matter. So there were apple tarts, but really, have you ever seen a Dutch master painting that was an apple pie, a delicious double crust or maybe lattice top apple pie? No, you don't see those in Europe. That's just not, that was not something that was, a light and flaky crust was unheard of in Europe. In fact, The English had a crust that they made to hold a filling. It could be a meat pie, it could be fruit, but it was hard as concrete. And it was just, it was dense and not very good. And they called it a coffin, is how bad it was. So that was what the English thought of as pies. When the first pilgrims came, at this replica of the Mayflower, when the pilgrims came, they brought apple seeds. They brought seeds of lots of crops, but they were going to adapt to some of the American crops as well. But apple seeds in particular, because an apple tree can grow to maturity and bear fruit in as short a time as 2 years. Some varieties take as long as 8, but some will bloom and produce apples in 2 years. So you'd have a familiar food right there that you'd like. Also, apples could be taken, and when you harvested them, you could cut them into slices and dry them and keep them in the cellar during the winter, and you'd have a little sweet treat. And apples make apple cider. And when you're a long way from home on a hostile shore, a little alcohol can't hurt at all. But it was a very early American cookbook. It was written in 1786, the same year our Constitution was ratified, 1786. And a woman named Amelia Simmons put together a cookbook. And her cookbook was supposed to be especially for American cooks. But she often would take native ingredients and that had been in America for a long time and perhaps cooked by the indigenous people, but then apply European cooking techniques to those native ingredients. So she wanted it particularly to be a very special American cook. And it had a recipe for apple pie. Apple pie as we know it today, just like that. A recipe in 1786. One food writer wrote that Amelia Simmons, in her own minor sphere, was another declaration of American independence, because this book ultimately established a definitive version of American apple pie. It was there at the very beginning of the U.S., solid and comforting, a harbinger of the country that had already undergone, and of all the things the country had already undergone, and a pleasing look at what was to come. That would be apple pie. All right, today's August 14th, right? Guess what Starbucks is putting out on August 21st, 1 week from today? Pumpkin spice lattes. So that tells you a little bit about how much Americans like their pumpkins. Now, pumpkins are a Native American crop. They were pretty much the major food source for most of the North American continent. My family and I just got back from a trip to Colorado, where we visited the cliff dwellings of the indigenous people there. And their main source of protein was turkey, and they also had corn, pumpkins, and beans. Now, corn, pumpkin, and beans are called the three sister crops, and the indigenous Americans knew how to grow them and how to use them in a symbiotic way. The tall, strong corn stalk could support a bean vine going up, and the pumpkins on the soil underneath it, or any other kind of hard squash, usually a hard squash, because those were good winter crops that would keep a long time. And you could plant those underneath it, and it would keep the soil moist and provide a wonderful food. Now, they didn't make apple pie, a pumpkin pie. How old were you when you first heard that charming story about the Pilgrims and the Native Americans who waved them on shore and welcomed them? Story. Historians have found many differences in what really happened. And so how old were you when you found that out and were disillusioned? even though we're now thankfully more open to discussing and acknowledging the reality of some of the history there, we still cling tight to those traditions. The turkey, the pumpkin pie at Thanksgiving, those are all supposed to be really part of our family's Thanksgiving. But before pumpkin was a vital part of your Thanksgiving table, it was a vital part of the diet of North America, of the indigenous people of North America. One reason is that three sisters and that symbiotic relationship. And these items were readily incorporated into the European diet, into the settlers' diet: corn, beans, and squash, because they made a complete protein when they were together. It was not one of those things that you didn't have a dietitian telling you. But if you were an indigenous person, you knew that those crops kept your family healthy. They did not have flour. They didn't, because they weren't growing wheat, and they didn't have sugar. So the idea of pumpkin pie was nothing that they would have thought of. The one account from a settler said that the Native Americans did not like the sweet taste at all. And about the only sweetener that they had, especially in the Northeast, was maple syrup. They didn't have sugar, and they didn't have honey, because the bees were brought over by the settlers. In fact, the indigenous people called the bees English flies, because they would, be bothersome and buzz around. So it wasn't until after the English established honey and hives that the natives had much sweetener at all. So the settlers adapted those three, especially those three crops, into their things. But one colonial song that goes back to 1630, so just 20 years after the Pilgrims landed, went like this. Instead of pottage, puddings, and custards and pies, our pumpkins and parsnips are our common supply. We have pumpkins at morning and pumpkins at noon. If it were not for pumpkins, we should all be undone. So whether or not they liked it, they ate the pumpkins. Now, they didn't eat it as pies. Again, they didn't have flour. They didn't have sugar. They certainly didn't have the spices. But with the advent of trade on the East Coast and the colonists there, they might have spices imported from the West Indies, and they might have flour supplies delivered from England. And by the 18th century, pumpkin pie was a staple. It was included in Amelia Simmons' cookbook. So pumpkin pie is pretty early evidence of using some of those things. Her recipe would take standard English cooking practices to the indigenous ingredients that the settlers found, and so they took a lot of advantage of the pumpkin. It became a European interpretation of pumpkin, completely divorced from its indigenous origins, which is kind of a shame. Pumpkin pie was firmly in the lexicon of Americana by 1834, when Lydia Marie Child penned the Ode to Thanksgiving, over the river and through the woods to grandmother's house to go, which ends with a rousing hooray for the pumpkin pie. So by 1834, we really knew about pumpkin pie. Okay, now let's move to a little sadder time in American history. Molasses. Molasses might not be in your pantry today, but it was one of the earliest sweeteners in the colonies and later in the United States. In fact, one historian said that the colonists were likely to have 3 M's in their larders: meat, usually salt pork; meal, probably cornmeal; and molasses. Molasses was the sweetener that was used. And it wasn't just used in the South. We kind of think of it as a Southern dish, but think of Boston baked beans has molasses in it. Molasses was used in brewing, beer especially, and sometimes whiskeys or moonshine. And so it was used all over the country. In fact, there was a molasses distilling factory in Boston where there was an explosion and over 1 million gallons of molasses flowed in the streets of Boston, and one person even drowned in molasses. So that's how popular molasses was. Eventually, some enterprising cook, innovative, remember those innovative cooks, put together some eggs, some sugar, some molasses, maybe a little flour, and yes, a little more sugar, and made a molasses pie. Molasses pies became very popular in the South, especially in Virginia for some reason. There was in their cookbooks all the time, and many of the Virginia cookbooks of the 18th and 19th century, you'll find a recipe for molasses pie, and eventually made their way into the kitchens of the plantations. But here's the rest of the story. Molasses is a byproduct of sugarcane, and sugarcane is a crop that could not have been grown profitably without enslaved labor. So the idea of being sent to the sugar plantations was a frightening one to slaves. It was held as a threat, held over their head as a threat. But that it was a hot, dirty, inhumane way to raise crop, and it had to be done. You couldn't be done profitably without enslaved labor. Even after the Civil War ended enslavement in the reunited country, molasses, and by extension, molasses pie, continued to have a foothold in the cuisine of America. But it is a bittersweet reminder of some of the crops that had to be grown. Okay. Now we're going to jump overseas for a few minutes. That's Napoleon. Napoleon was rampaging all over Europe, and he had his army of thousands of men with him. Well, if you've got thousands of men coming along behind you, you've got to feed them all. Well, Napoleon would carry a herd of cattle with him and ravage the countryside, getting fresh food, fresh vegetables and things for his army to eat. And he asked his officers, he had a contest among his officers and asked them to come up with a way to preserve food. And one of his officers, a man named Nicholas Appert, came up with the idea of taking glass jars, boiling them, putting barely cooked food in there, and then sealing the glass jars. Preserved food. That came from Napoleon's army. Is that going to make a difference in how the whole world looks at food, right? Especially those in America. And with that, we have Cairo syrup. Okay, so Cairo syrup is one of the earliest examples we have of a corn syrup that we're going to talk about in a minute being preserved and being used. Now, what do we use Cairo syrup for mostly these days? I call it Cairo nut pie. That was what I grew up calling it, but I think in Texas people call it pecan pie. Pecans are indigenous to America. We know that George Washington had a pecan orchard at Mount Vernon because it's listed in his inventory. Some of the earliest recipes for pecan pies said to take pecans and boil them in milk and then strain them out and make a custard with the eggs and the milk and some sugar and put a meringue on top of it. That sounds like way too much trouble for me, and it doesn't even sound as delicious as what we know of pecan pies today. In 1913, a lady named Vesta Harris, Miss Vesta Harris, from Fort Worth, Texas, won $500 in a cooking contest with a recipe for pecan pie that used molasses, eggs, sugar, and pecans to have the beginning of the kind of pecan pies that we know today. And it didn't take long for that pie to be known throughout the world. Now, that pie's dramatic spike in popularity is thanks to this idea of a commercialized and canned food and preserved food product. and that dates back to Napoleon's soldiers, specifically Cairo corn syrup. Now today, we look at labels looking for corn syrup as an ingredient, and it's not necessarily one of our top things, but it was very popular. Cairo jumped into the market before Coca-Cola, before Cracker Jacks, before Jell-O. Many years later, our diets are still impacted by the idea of corn syrup. You know, some people like to go to Dublin, Texas to get Dr. Pepper with real sugar in it instead of corn syrup, and Coca-Cola's got mostly corn syrup in it. So we look at those things by labels today. But by 1920, processed foods was the largest manufacturing industry in America. And it wasn't steel, automobile, textiles, it was food processing. Now, Cairo. I put both sides of the Cairo bottle here because if you want to make a pecan pie, you don't have to look up the recipe. Just buy your bottle of Cairo. It's always on the bottle, on the back of the bottle, the recipe for Cairo nut pie. So, but Cairo was a liquid sweetener that didn't crystallize when you heated it. It didn't turn to sugar. It was derived from cornstarch, and it soon became consolidated under a single brand. There were lots of different corn syrups out there, but by 1900, it was consolidated as Cairo. Do you remember it used to come in cans that you had to pry the lid off of? I remember my mother prying that lid off and then pouring some in a little pitcher with a lid to use at the table. It was called a great spread for daily bread. By 1901, the Cairo Company spent a massive $250,000 on advertising and making Cairo a household name. They would say things in their ads like, "Thousands of people eat Cairo freely who cannot digest other sweets," or "Men at hard labor find they can go further on a diet of bread and Cairo than almost any other ration." Facts, proof, scientific knowledge? No, not so much. It was just what they were selling, a product. It was Cairo. Okay, Cairo and that pie hit the market in 1930, and it became the definitive version of that dish. And Cairo would put that recipe in every cookbook they could. They printed it on the back of their bottle that they sold. And now corn syrup is the foundation of our processed food industry and used to make pretty much everything. So it's fairly fitting that corn syrup, perhaps the most industrialized of all commercial food products, was the ingredient that made an obscure pie go national and become a staple in the American pie choices. Now you can try replacing that Cairo with alternative sweeteners like maple syrup or sorghum, or you can pick up a bottle of Cairo and make a pretty darn good pie with it. Well, now just a quick word about the 1930s and the Depression. Mock apple pies are made of crackers. And every time I do this, somebody said, "Oh, I use Ritz crackers." Have anybody made a mock apple pie? Yeah? You use Ritz crackers. They're richer, I guess. But in the Depression, you might have more access to saltines. Home cooks were forced to become innovative. If you wanted to serve your family something, a sweet treat, and something familiar, you would do almost anything to be able to do that. And so the innovation of American cooks has been there all along. Remember, we've talked a little bit about it, but especially when times were hard and ingredients were scarce, American cooks were innovative. They would use what products they had, because as it turns out, crackers ground to pieces and coated in spices and sugar syrup and then tucked beneath a crust turned out to be a pie that tasted almost like real apples. The secret was probably in the cream of tartar. A little bit of acid in there gave it that apple feeling. And during the Great Depression, families relied on food from the Red Cross or other places, and they might get flour and lard and beans and sugar, but no fresh fruits or vegetables. And so it was the moms who innovated and made this as a special treat for their family. It was a useful way to create the familiar staples of family taste, even during a time of severe want. Yum. Doesn't that look yummy? That was from an ad in Good Housekeeping magazine in the 1950s. And the words around it said, "At last, a creamy, dreamy coconut pie. You can make it home in minutes." Sounds good, doesn't it? This is a full-page ad in Good Housekeeping magazine. It went on to say, "Taste homemade, a thrifty treat, quicker, easier, more economical. A luscious homemade coconut cream pie like you've never had before." Makes you drool, right? Looks pretty good there. Okay. So that over-the-top ad in the 1951 Good Housekeeping showed a stereotypical American housewife. She was white, of course, wearing a blue dress with a frilly apron. Her hair was pinned back exactly right. And she was holding out this pie to her family. And it said, it represented the American dream. Rosie the Riveter is gone from the factories and back in the American home. And Rosie the Riveter is now expected to be Hannah the housewife and making all these luscious things for your family. But she's also got to keep house. So she's looking for time-saving things. And she fills her pantry with Jell-O pudding and pie filling or Dream Whip, all of those things that you can keep as staples in your pantry. There was, in one of the Betty Crocker cookbooks in 1950, Betty Crocker, the icon of Betty Crocker cookbooks, wrote, "If I were to design a coat of arms for the United States, it would have a pie at the center." That's how important it was. And what Jell-O and other corporate food advertisers sold was better pie, and so therefore a better housewife. Because American families now were signaling the 4 S's: the suburbs, supper time, stability, and stereotypes. That was what we saw during the 50s. And cooks took advantage of that, of the things that were advertised to them to innovate and make these wonderful things for their families. Even Eleanor Roosevelt, a notoriously bad cook, as early as 1933, wrote a little booklet for American women called "It's Up to the Women." And she wrote in that book, "Too much emphasis cannot be laid on the importance of the preparation of food. And where the preparation of food, choice of food is concerned, it is important that the mother study all of the latest suggestions in the way of inexpensive and yet nourishing meals." So even Eleanor Roosevelt was encouraging these women to look for the best buys and make the best nourishment for their family. Now, the role of women's magazines in encouraging this domestic goddess persona was immense, and the advertisers took right to it. There were magical food products that could make a woman's life better. You could get frozen orange juice. You could get fruit cocktail in a can. You could get all these ingredients that would make a wonderful pie. All of those things were right at your fingertips because the ad men told you so. The ad men's motto was, "Creativity is the fairy dust that would transform opening boxes into real cooking." And they emphasized fast, simple, and sure, and sold many a product to our mothers. I know my mother homemade her lemon meringue and chocolate meringue fillings, but there was boxes of Jell-O in her pantry too. So I know that was part of the cooking. In 1936, a new show aired on PBS. A surprising debut, Julia Child's The French Kitchen. And this show helped shift American cookery once again. Americans' taste had changed. They were traveling abroad. the GIs wanted to go back to Europe and take their families to see where they had been. So their tastes were beginning to change. Up until this point, most towns did not have an Italian restaurant, a French restaurant, a Vietnamese restaurant that we can't easily have today, a Mexican restaurant in a small town in Arkansas. We didn't have any of those. The only exception would have been Chinese restaurants, because the business model for the Chinese restaurants were a family would immigrate, and when they got here, they would open a restaurant, and then as soon as that restaurant was successful, they would have more of their family come and set them up in a second restaurant in the town. I know in my little hometown in Arkansas, there were 3 Chinese restaurants because that was their business model, and it was a successful way to do it. But an Italian restaurant, a pizza restaurant, those just weren't happening in the 1950s until Julia Child came along and expanded our taste. And one article, this idea of a foreign food, people in America looked at kind of iffy until Julia Child came along. So when quiche landed in America, one article called it the quintessential 70s cliche. And by the time Bruce Firestein wrote the book, Real Men Don't Eat Quiche, it was already kind of an accepted thing. But he wrote this book kind of tongue-in-cheek. It was kind of a hit at the time. You probably remember reading it, Real Men Don't Eat Quiche. Men had an aversion to French food. That could go back to Patrick Henry, back in the Virginia House of Burgesses. Thomas Jefferson was sitting over there, and Patrick Henry rose to speak and pointed to Thomas Jefferson and says, he has an effete taste for French cookery, almost like an accusation. And if anybody's seen Hamilton, you know, Thomas Jefferson comes back in from France going, what have I missed? So I imagine those House of Burgesses people were a little upset with him for not being there all the time. Okay, now women could eat that Frenchified food, but real men would eat steak and more steak. I mean, can you see Clint Eastwood sitting down to a slice of zucchini quiche? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. However, one reporter asked, you like eggs? You like bacon? You like pie crust? You put them together, you got quiche. It would seem kind of a strange new world where the cook bakes a warm, fragrant quiche with a custardy streaked with bacon and Gruyere cheese, wafting off the scent, wafting from the oven, and that silken custard there. It would be hard to turn it down, even by a masculine persona, when in reality the quiche is just an unlucky, savory little pie with a French pedigree. Okay, when we last left apple pie, it was in Amelia Simmons' cookbook, the first cookbook in America to feature apple pie. How did it get to be America's pie over all of those other pie crust, pie, different flavors of pie? How did we get to be American as apple pie? As far back as 1889, the editor of the Milwaukee Sentinel newspaper wrote an editorial titled, "The National Emblem, What's the Matter with the American Apple Pie?" And he said in that editorial, he went on to lay out a compelling case for why the country should anoint this humble dessert as our national emblem. He said his reasoning referred to many of the same virtues suggested in the decades to come when people discussed apple pie status as an American institution. Its universality. He said, the apple pie grows in every section of this country. The apple grows in every section of the country, so it's widely available. Every true American eats apple pie. He said, its hardiness, it is substantial, it's satisfying, it's hard to digest, and therefore no light or trifling symbol of the solid, satisfying, and tenacious life of America. Its lack of acceptances by other countries. He said, it is hated, reviled, and feared by foreigners, just as our great republic has been. Like our free institutions, the apple pie has held its own against the world. Well, the editor went on to suggest that perhaps it should be a requirement of American life. He declared, we should embody in the Constitution of the United States of America a requirement that no foreign national should receive their final papers of naturalization until he should sit down and eat a whole apple pie in the presence of the court. In the 20th century, as American as apple pie emerged as a part of our cultural lexicon, when such influential factors as advertising and news and wars created a new narrative that effectively transformed this dish into a grand national symbol. Soldiers from home in the canteens of the USO wanted Mom's apple pie. That's what they wanted to eat. They wanted cigarettes, hot coffee, and Mom's apple pie in the canteens. And so that kind of made it a symbol. It's as American as baseball, as American as the girl next door. All of those things has been compared to it. And really, if we study the roots of apple pie, remember those seeds came from Europe with the Pilgrims. The pastry crust were first made, really flaky pastry crusts were first made in the Middle East. Think of pita bread. And the spices, the earliest spices would have come from the Far East, China, the cinnamon and everything. What a melting pot that classic American apple pie became. And with that, I want to talk about this cookbook. This cookbook is called 50 Pies, 50 States by a woman named Stacy Mei Wang Fong. She was an immigrant from China. And when she came to the United States, she was making friends and they would ask her, where are you from? Where do you call home? And she realized that she really had no place that she called home. Her father had been in the hotel business. So she lived all over the Far East in different major cities. This is a picture of Hong Kong Harbor because she remembers her favorite music genre was American country and Western. And she remembers sitting on her teenage bed in Hong Kong, looking out at Hong Kong Harbor and hearing on her Walkman Dolly Parton songs. So that was her basic, how she grew up. And then she went to a British school high school when she was in Hong Kong. And so she watched a lot of American TV. Whoops, sorry, let me back up one. She watched a lot of American TV when she was a teenager. And so she decided when she went into college, she wanted to go somewhere in the United States. And she watched an American TV show about American teenagers called One Tree Hill. It took place in Savannah, Georgia. She loved the look of Savannah, those live oak trees with the moss hanging from it. And so she decided she wanted to go to school in Savannah. She wanted to major in art and design. That was kind of her thing. And so she found the Savannah School of Art. She applied and was accepted and then went to Google, where is Savannah? That was where she found out where she was going to school. So she went to Savannah and she made friends there. And she was often invited to the friends' homes because it was way too far for her to go home for a holiday. So she would be invited to their homes. And she realized that home didn't have to be a place. It could be an idea. And she liked the idea of America. So when she graduated, she went to work as a handbag designer in New York, lived in Brooklyn, where she met people from all over. She met Europeans, she met Asians, she met more Americans from every state you could imagine. And she liked the idea of this kind of a hodgepodge of coming together to make a home. And that was what she did there. And she decided it was time to make it formal. And after 10 years, she got her naturalization papers and became a U.S. citizen. At that point, she quit her job as a handbag designer and was kind of at loose ends until a friend gave her a cookbook, and she started making American pies. And she found that was a hobby that calmed her and made her more serene. So she opened a pie shop in Brooklyn called 4 and 20 Blackbirds. Isn't that cute? And I looked it up, and it is still there, 4 and 20 Blackbirds. And then she went with friends and began traveling all over the United States. She wanted to go to each state and write a cookbook. And she wanted to include some of her own experiences in there. It is beautifully illustrated. This is her tribute to Hong Kong, a lime pie with real orchids on it. And look at that fruit on it. Every picture is just that beautiful. That's her tribute to Hong Kong. That's her tribute to Washington, D.C. Blueberries, strawberries, and rhubarb. Now remember, she's an artist, okay? So she can make beautiful things like that. Then she has a pie for each state. Well, I had to find out what Arkansas was, and she found for Arkansas a savory pie, heirloom tomato and cheddar cheese pie. So that's that pie. Now, you're going to be mad when you find out what Texas is. It's not pecan. Remember, she had to do 50 states. She had to be original. Remember, she's an artist. Here's her Texas pie. It is a ruby red grapefruit pie topped with candied jalapenos. Now, the recipe is like a lemon pie filling. Only instead of using lemon juice, you would use a ruby red grapefruit juice. I figure when she came to Texas, she came in through the valley, ate a ruby red grapefruit, and went, "This is it." So that could be it. So, and then there's her George Washington cherry pie. Remember, she's an artist. She used coffee to paint the picture of George Washington there. She said in her book, she called her book a love letter to America, to her new country. And she wrote in the introduction, "I love America coast to coast and from sea to shining sea. Sometimes America may disappoint me, and I recognize her shortcomings. I may be slowed down, but America always seems to build me back up." And so Stacy offers her readers this trip to each state to look up a pie. And she picks a person and a little bit of the history of the state and this pie recipe for each of the 50 states, and remembering her background in the Far East. I want to close again with that American favorite, apple pie. Apples are just part of our life. I've got some in the fruit bowl on my table today. We went on vacation last week and actually picked some apples that I'm going to make with cinnamon and butter as a side dish this week. Apple pie is not American because it's wholesome, hearty, or indigenous. It is all of those things. It's American because of the way cultures and different foods and traditions from all over the world have been combined to make this apple pie. So the U.S. was woven by cultural influences and traditions from all over the world, just like the U.S. Apple pie. It's distinct all on its own, and so is apple pie. My friend Mary Lee shared this with me last week. It's a sign from a cafe in East Texas. So let's close our culinary journey with this last quote. "Do not ask whither or why, just sit back and enjoy the pie." Thank you all. So anybody have a favorite pie they want to tout tonight?
I think I like all those pies. What a way to finish, huh? Right? Thank you, Dana. So, I was watching the closing ceremonies of the Olympics last Sunday, right? And what does the head of the International Olympic Committee chairman always say? He says, "I call on the youth of the world to convene in 4 years in Los Angeles." So I'm calling on the attendees of the Rejebian Review Series to convene in this spot in 303 days. Have a great rest of the year, and we'll look forward to seeing you again.